I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I'm running to be the next Rhode Island Attorney General. I practiced law for the last 16 years, 12 of them in the office of the Attorney General, so I have the knowledge and experience to do that job at a high level. I'm not here to fight for a political agenda. I'm not here to fight for a special interest. I'm here to fight for the rights of every Rhode Islander, no matter where you come from or no matter what your background is. I'll need your votes on September 13th for the primary election and November 8th for the general election. If you have any questions about where to vote or how to vote, please contact your local Board of Canvassers or the Secretary of State's office or website. I'm not running to be just another politician. I'm running to be a public servant who can serve as a much-needed check and balance on the state of Rhode Island to root out the corruption both inside and outside of our system. We need your support. You can visit my website at chas4ag.com to learn more about me, donate, or volunteer your time. I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I approve this message.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today's program is dedicated to the issue of Kurds, of their history in the Middle East, and in particular, Iraq. And with us today is Dr. Pari Karadaghi. She's the author of a new book on the subject, available now on Kindle, on Amazon, and I'll give her an opportunity to share the exact information about that later today during our discussion. She is a historian, she's a human rights activist, past president of the Kurdish Human Rights Watch, and we'll be discussing this issue today, coming at a pivotal moment when Kurds in Iraq are once again under attack. Good evening, Dr. Karadaghi. Welcome to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Before we start talking about your book, I did want to have an opportunity to ask you a couple of questions about yourself and introduce you to our audience, which is international. And every week we have an in-depth discussion about a global topic that often
does
not get enough coverage or enough good coverage in the mainstream media. So tell us about yourself, about your work in activism on Kurdish human rights, your background, and how you decided to write this book.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I started out working on human rights issues and advocacy, and going to the Hill, to U.S. Congress and the Senate when my father was alive, and I was kind of being trained to do this work. And it it followed a lot of activities and a lot of visits to the Hill and asking people for assistance and support for the Kurdish issue. And we also talked a lot about refugee issues and immigrant issues, as well as the internally displaced Kurdish population in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And many of the discussions entailed humanitarian relief and human rights issues and protection, because they were not by definition refugees, they were internally displaced persons. And until the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees started recognizing internal displaced persons, or IDPs, they were called displaced, or they were not refugees, so to speak. And then I started working with Kurdish Human Rights Watch, which my father had started, and he needed some help with running the organization and fundraising and writing grants. And we wrote several grants, and some of them were funded and some of them were not. And the ones that were funded started some good programs that helped both the community in the United States and the community, a Kurdish community overseas, in Iraq, especially. In refugee camps, we documented some of the atrocities that were committed by the Turkish government against IDPs and refugees that were in Turkey. And as a result, there were many observations and reports that were issued following our call to action. In the 1980s, 1988 especially, the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein used chemical weapon on the Kurdish population, and gas, sarin gas, nerve gases. And as a result, many died and many were victims of deportation and mass deportation and dislocation. Some of them were put into collective villages that were pretty much concentration camps, pretty much, because they had no right to go out or to do anything. And their homes and their livestock and their lands were confiscated by the government, and they couldn't return to them. So they were in this brick and mortar buildings that were built ad hoc to house them. It was hot in the winter, in the summer, and cold in the winter, and they had to survive these conditions. And they also carried out an operation called Anfal campaign. Anfal campaign was a deliberate genocidal and gendercidal action by the government of Iraq against the Kurdish population. And it resulted in the death of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and dislocation and deportation of many of them to the desert in the south of Iraq. And some of them were killed, some of them were in prisons, some of them were in those collective villages that they had built for them. So I got involved in all of this, and I started working for Kurdish Human Rights Watch. And after that, it became a part of the daily activities and daily actions that we would take and advocate, as well as provide direct services to them.
What was the reaction of the American society, of the regular people at the time you were working on this? Was there a great deal of publicity about what was happening at the time?
Well, U.S. Congress, then Ambassador Peter Galbraith worked as an international staff for international affairs staff for one of the senators. And the senator heard about this atrocities committed against the Kurds and sent Peter Galbraith and Chris Van Hollen, who is now senator in Maryland, to investigate the situation back in 1988. And they came back and confirmed that there was chemical weapon used. They tested the people that survived the chemical weapon, and their nails and their hair and samples were taken, and it was demonstrated and proven that chemical weapon was used against them. He came back, wrote a report that was given to the Senate and to the House, and for some reason, no action was taken. Then Iraq was, Saddam Hussein was a U.S. interest. They had him groomed to be fighting or opposing Iran and Iran's actions in Middle East. And Saddam Hussein portrayed himself as the man who would solve the crisis between the Shiites and the Sunnis and protect the Arab world. Of course, all of those were lies, and nobody trusted him with their livelihood, but that's what he proclaimed.
Ironically, this is the image that still persists in much of the Arab world, as well as in political circles in the United States. What has kept this legend alive, despite the fact that Hussein is gone, and so his background and his ideology and his associations should by now be a matter of public record?
It should, actually, you're right. And in some circles, they still refer to him as an Arab nationalist but really he was a psychopath and a dictator, and none of the things that he did really eventually helped the people of Iraq, and especially in the Kurdish situation. He negated on several agreements, the 1970 agreement, which gave the Kurds the right to self-determination, and similar to what now we have, the Kurdish government that's in Kurdistan in Iraq and recognized by the central government, although there are still problems. But the first real serious act was the 1970 peace agreement between the Iraqi government and the Kurdish nationalists. And he was supposed to give them full self-determination and autonomy in 1974. But he changed his mind, just like he usually used to do, and decided to fight the Kurds and said that that agreement is null.
We have seen a pattern of flip-flopping on the Kurdish issue across the region. Certainly, Hussein was the best known on this issue, at least at the time, but he was certainly not the only one. Assad in Syria, at the very least, appeared initially to be aligned, or at least not directly against the Kurdish interests, but later on certainly was not particularly helpful, if not to say quite the opposite. Erdogan came to power claiming to be all for peace building and autonomy and so forth, but when it became convenient to him, changed his mind, started accusing everyone of being PKK, and you know the rest of it. So there is this historical pattern of very strong men across the region, making promises to the Kurds, making alliances with the Kurds, promising autonomy, promising fair treatment, but changing their minds and ultimately leaving civilian populations helpless. And yet, despite all of that, the issue of statehood or greater protections for the autonomies has never been backed or fully resolved in any of those places. And every
Right.
time you hear everyone saying, well, but this guy is actually not so bad, and this guy you can come to some sort of agreement. But we have the pattern of all these people not being democratic, first of all. Even if they come through democratic means, they later change, corrupt the process, as what we're seeing in
Yes.
Turkey. And second, not keeping their word. So why is that the international community believes these people?
Well, it's good that you just mentioned Syria, because Assad had a policy of stripping the Syrian citizenship from the Kurdish population. So a lot of the Kurds that were living in Syria, that were born and raised in Syria and had Syrian nationality, they canceled their nationalities and were now with no identity, no papers, nothing. I mean, a husband and a wife could not go to a hotel because they had to prove that they are Syrians, and also they have a marriage license, and nobody would give them a marriage license. Turkey, Erdogan came to power promising peace and stability and economic reform, and promising the Kurds equal rights and recognition of their political party. In the beginning, there was a recognition of HDP as a political party that went for elections and was democratically elected by the population. However, Erdogan, with his promises, fooled the Kurds, because they believed in him, and in essence, he negated on his promises while he was in campaign, election campaign. The Kurds voted for him and put him in power because they thought that he was going to be honest and forthcoming and honor his promises. Unfortunately, those were all negotiations between the PKK and the Turkish government keep stalling, and they don't issue an amnesty. So the PKK forces, if they decide to go home, they get arrested. In addition, the Turkish government arrests MP members, the ones that are HDP and are in the Turkish parliament. Some of them, most of them, are in jail now, and they're accused, even though Turkey asked them to be a mediator between Turkish government and the PKK. Now they're labeling them all PKK and arresting them and imprisoning them. Iran is not any better. I'm sure you have seen this new uprisings in Iran and the death of Mahsa Amini, who was her real Kurdish name is Gina Amini. So the movement, women, life, liberty, freedom, is started with the death of Ms. Amini, that was killed by the morality police because her hijab was not covering her whole head. There was some hair showing. And as a result, she was beaten and tortured and died in police custody.
Go ahead.
Now the movement, we see that the rest of Iran has started moving along the same, asking for women freedom and women liberation and women equal rights. And it's very good that the rest of Iran is also involved, not just the Kurdish population, because they have been cracking down on the militants and the activists, and lots of arrests and torture, and people are dying under torture. So Iran is not any better. Actually, when Khomeini came to power, he proclaimed that killing Kurds was legal, and killing Kurds was a good deed in front of God because they were non-believers, even though the Kurds are Muslims. He declared them good to be killed.
Is it because they're mostly Sunni, or was it because he was racist and was just using that as an excuse?
I think he was using it as an excuse. He was racist, and also the Kurds had revolted against him and were doing very well and progressing, but they cracked down on all of the Kurdish militants, and as a result, they left Iran and went and sought protection in safe havens in Kurdistan in Iraq, and some of them were received by the Iraqi authorities. They were sent to collective villages in the south. Many of them still remain in Iraq. Many of them were resettled by UNHCR to foreign countries, Canada, Australia, United States, Europe. So that wasn't. They have stopped resettlement. Most of them are, chronic refugees, if you may, and are in there for a long time, and are now they can't have Iraqi nationality.
Mm-hmm.
They can have Iraqi residence or Kurdistan residence and work and live and have their kids go to school in those places.
So the big question is, how did such a huge nation as Kurds, with over 30 million people, end up being cheated out of a state when you have other tribal societies scattered across the Middle East, and who ended up with various, states, despite the fact that tribal societies don't necessarily have, strictly speaking, state lines. So how did it end up that the Kurdish populations were completely cut out of it on this basis, and have not been able to assert their independence? And let's start with the basic questions. Who are the Kurds? Because people are aware of where they are. People are aware that they have their own distinct languages and culture, but who are they exactly originally? I don't think that there's much understanding or discussion about that.
Yes, the Kurds are Indo-European ethnic group that is the only nation without a country in the world, and the largest actually ethnic population without a country of their own. There are many religions within the Kurdish faith. They have Zoroastrians, Yazidi, Christian, and Muslim Sunnis, as well as Muslim Shiites. And most of the population recognizes themselves as Kurds. So it would be Iraqi Kurd, Iranian Kurd, Turkish Kurd, Syrian Kurd. We refer to them as East, West, North, and South. South is Kurdistan, Iraq. North is Kurdistan, Turkey. And East and West are Iran and Syria. The population identifies with the Kurdish identity. And it's very important to Kurds to be recognized as such. Unfortunately, the division of the Kurdistan, larger Kurdistan, was done and divided by the British and the French, who were partitioning or taking over the Ottoman Empire post-World War I. There was a 1916 agreement between the British official who was mandated for Iraq and French person in charge, and both of them were Sykes and Picot. Picot was the French, and the Sykes was the British official, and they decided to divide the whole Kurdistan area into being borders of Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. And unfortunately, the Kurds were not consulted on this. Then the peace agreement of Paris was going on. The Kurds did a presentation there and showed the maps and areas where the Kurds live and requested that they take them in consideration. Then later, there was the Lausanne peace agreement, which promised the Kurds a country and also designated Turkey as a country, because it was the Ottoman Empire, remnants of the Ottoman Empire, and they decided to name it Turkey. Unfortunately, Turkey did not honor their promises that they made in Lausanne, and Sykes-Picot agreement became a reality, a nightmare for the Kurdish population, unfortunately.
So we are seeing these divisions made by European colonial powers and other groups that are disenfranchising entire populations being held up today as sacrosanct nationalist criteria by which the entire world should abide. But the question is whether perhaps it is time to reconsider international treaties in that regard, given that the way they were formed was dubious, to say the least, to begin with. Now, there is also the question of pragmatic reality, the fact that Baghdad, Ankara, their respective populations, certainly Tehran, and Damascus are not interested in sharing power, territory, or resources, or anything else with.
Yes.
There is that pragmatic reality, which essentially means either a forceful intervention by third parties, a civil war, regional conflagration, but they're certainly not going to make it easy for the Kurds to retain independence. But from the perspective of international recognition, why do you think these artificial boundaries that were always a source of nothing but division and dispute are suddenly being considered fair when the people most affected and impacted by them were not consulted or involved in the decision-making process and are now being forced to live under somebody else's rules? On the one hand,
in 2016 marked 100 years since Sykes-Picot agreement, and to this day the Kurds are suffering because of this agreement. And like you said, international powers, international countries are recognizing those boundaries, those areas of them, the current map of Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And I talk about it in the book and mention the Sykes-Picot agreement and also the British mandate in Iraq and the French mandate in Syria. The British mandate in Iraq, for some reason, they did not consider the Kurds power sharing. And there was a revolution by King Mahmud, who was the Kurdish fighter or freedom fighter, and they exiled him. They shot him, exiled him to India, where he stayed, and then later he was brought back to Kurdistan, and then later he died. But he carried out 2 revolutions against the British mandate and wanted to liberate Kurdistan. They never had an agreement with him. They did not honor their promises, which were not kept.
Now, Kurdish populations scattered across the Middle East have a multiplicity of political parties and as well as sectarian divisions and internal tribal disputes. What was the process? But you're mentioning the king, who seemed to at that point, at least, speaking on behalf of the Kurdish population as a whole.
Yes.
What happened to his line, and how did we currently end up with all these parties that have very divergent interests, sometimes conflicts of interest, and to the point that you almost have several different societies and not just one country?
Right. And the psychology of a divided nation, a nation that's persecuted, always is mistrusting of authority and mistrusting of negotiations, peace agreements. And as such, there has been several political parties that have emerged. And these political parties are in Iraq and Iran. They have the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which was started first in Iran in 1946, when they declared the Republic of Mahabad, which was supported by Russia. But unfortunately, Russia did an agreement with Iran and pulled out all of the resources that they had for the Kurdish government. And the United States did not recognize the Kurdish government at all. And you see segments of this repeating itself. Unfortunately for the Kurds in Turkey, their PKK has been labeled as a terrorist organization, and as such has very limited input or limited actions inside Turkey. And as such, they go into negotiations and agreements, and unfortunately, Turkey does not honor them at the end. In Iraq, in 2017, there was a referendum that was carried out, which 95% of the population wanted independence from Iraq. There was no international recognition for it. No Iraqi government actually did not recognize it, even though it's in the Iraqi constitution, which I have studied. And initially, when it was being drafted, I had my input on it. And in the constitution, it says at any point with the Kurdish regional government, if they decide to separate from Iraq and seek independence, they may do so by having a referendum. And that's what they did. They had a referendum, and the referendum was denied by the government in Baghdad, even though the Iraqi president is Kurdish but has no say in it. As a result, the Iraqi forces attacked the city of Kirkuk, disposed of the governor, the governing council, the members of the community councils that exist, and appointed an Arab mayor or governor in Kirkuk. And there are many examples of how there are some agreements at some point, and then there are misinterpretation of the so-called peace agreement between the central government and the Kurdistan regional government, as well as other forces.
Now, I understand that the source of the contention over this was probably most likely access to the oil, which is largely located under the Kurdish control, and which is also highly desired by Iran, which has been smuggling oil from that area. But how did the Baghdad authorities justify their violation of their own constitution? What was the argument that they made?
They made no argument. They decided that they do not recognize the referendum, and as such, they attacked the Kurdistan region. They almost even attacked Erbil, and that if they had attacked Erbil and won the attack against Erbil, they would have had a rough time with the Kurdish Peshmerga, the freedom fighters. The Kurdistan regional government's forces are called Peshmerga, which is the one who faces death. And they were critical and very helpful during the fight against ISIL and ISIS. And because of their leadership, they defeated the ISIL and ISIS militants and took over some of the cities that they had taken over. And the Kurdish resistance movement of women, mostly women in Syria, also liberated Syrian towns and cities of ISIL and ISIS.
Now, coming back to Iraq, my understanding is one of the Kurdish parties there, the Talabani-led party, the Talabani family, ended up siding with Baghdad and Iran at that critical moment and contributed to the ability to take over that area by the Arab forces and the cleansing of the political authorities. What were they?
Yeah.
What did they have to gain from that arrangement? I mean, what are they gaining from it now? That's what.
Well, unfortunately, they didn't gain anything because they gained some power and some say in Baghdad and also in Tehran, because Tehran was against the referendum as well as was against the political forces, the Kurdish political forces. And PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, sided with Baghdad and with Tehran and fought against the Kurdish forces. Unfortunately, it's one of the things that repeats itself in the Kurdish history. And unfortunately, it's a very hard truth to admit that Kurds are fighting each other and are not united.
We have seen this kind of tribal warfare across many different countries, but eventually many of them ended up uniting either as republican entities or as monarchies. Do you think one of those paths is possible at the end of the road? Because unfortunately, the alternative is this continuous divisions that others, bigger actors, will exploit without a unified form of government across these regions. I don't really see how any of them will be able to even defend their basic rights, much less create some sort of a functional state.
Yes, in Iraq, the Kurdistan region carries out, as well as the Iraqi government carries out elections, and based on the elections, each party, how many votes they get representation in the Iraqi parliament as well as the Kurdistan parliament. And it's fair elections. It has been, there has been some irregularities, but mostly the international community that monitors the elections have deemed them fair and not fraudulent, if you may. That might help a little bit with the conflict between the political parties and the division of power and the involvement of all the political parties in the process of representation in parliament and in government and in regular political life and society. That's not something that's available for the Kurds in Iran, and certainly for the Kurds in Turkey is not available. Their only party that's officially recognized is HDP in Turkey, and unfortunately, many of their leaders are in prison because Turkey considers them terrorists, even though they haven't committed any acts of terror or affiliated with PKK. But unfortunately, we have one of their leaders, the co-president of HDP, Demirtas, Selahattin Demirtas, is in prison, and his health is really deteriorating while he's in prison. But unfortunately, Turkey doesn't provide the medical assistance or frees him, places him maybe on house arrest so that he can get medical treatment. Syria, the Kurds have managed since 2014 to create the United Syrian Forces that are against Assad, the son, not Assad, the older Assad. And unfortunately, Assad enters into negotiations with the Kurdish population, with the Kurdish political parties, and doesn't go anywhere. It stays the same. Things are pretty much the same. At some point, he was going to recognize the autonomous area, which would have been great for the Kurds in Syria if he would have recognized the governorates, the areas or counties that are mainly inhabited by Kurds to be recognized as autonomous. The other problem that the Kurds in Syria are facing, aside from ISIL and ISIS, is also the incursion of the Turkish forces into Syria and bombarding them and killing people and burning houses, which is really very difficult and nobody is saying anything to Turkey, even though they are invading another country.
Even Assad has been relatively silent. I don't see Assad's forces confronting Turkey over that issue, as if the Kurds were basically sacrificed to that effect. Nor do I see how civilian populations of Kurds in Syria present any threat to Turkish sovereignty in Turkey. I don't really see how Erdogan.
Yeah, they are avoiding. They are trying very hard. Turkey is trying very hard to avoid Kurds in Syria to be autonomous, and they're afraid of the KRG experience in Iraq, and of course Turkey continuously bombs Kurdish villages in Iraq, and Iraqi government doesn't say anything. The Iranian government bombs Kurdish cities that have opponents and militants from Iran, and Turkey also does the same thing, and Baghdad doesn't say anything. The last month, for the first time, after Turkey bombed a tourist city near Mosul, and many Arab citizens were killed that were there on vacation, the Iraqi government and the parliament issued a statement saying that they condemn the attacks by Turkey and would like them to leave their country alone. I don't know if anything will happen to it or any good outcome will be, but it's a start.
But well, we have seen the Kurds in Iraq also being under attack from two fronts. On the one hand, Turkish forces have been periodically striking them under the claims that they're attacking PKK, but inevitably striking civilian areas, refugee camps, Yazidis, and so forth. On the other hand, more recently, Iran has started attacking the Kurds there due to the tensions inside Iran with the Kurdish population. And what has been Baghdad's reaction by two different countries attacking the allegedly sovereign territory?
Yeah, it's very interesting that even despite the fact that this is international borders that they are crossing, they are bombing Kurdish population and Kurdish cities and villages. Turkey does the same thing. Iran does the same thing, and nobody says anything. Nobody interferes. Nobody issues a statement, or the U.S. government has been quiet. I mean, the Iranians bombed one base in Erbil that had US forces. And some of them were injured and some of them were killed. And we saw a statement from the Secretary of State. But other than that, there hasn't been any alarms raised or any statements made to condemn these actions.
What is the connection between Iran's recent attacks and what's happening inside its borders? After all, it's two separate things going on. What's happening domestically in Iran and what's happening in Iraq are two separate issues. How does Iran justify these incursions? What does it claim that the Kurds in Iraq are supporting the internal revolts? What's the actual official line here?
Mm-hmm. Well, they are saying that they're combating Zionism and colonialism, while because there's are bases that are occupied by Israel, and it's not true. Israel does not have any bases in Kurdistan. And even though the Israeli government and the Jewish people are sympathetic to the Kurdish issue, but there hasn't been any occupation of cities or centers or what have you. So that's their justification for bombing Kurdish cities and military bases and airports. And of course, they also bomb and cities that have Iranian Kurdish opposition groups that are living in Kurdistan and Iraq. And unfortunately, many people are being dead and hit by their bombing.
There's another factor that has also been not highlighted, which is the return of ISIS into the Kurdish areas and the various attacks, kidnappings, bombings, and so forth that have been going on. And before the war in Ukraine, and actually, at the end of Trump's term, there was some media coverage of that. But since then, I have not really seen much on that front. What has been happening in the last couple of years?
Yes, the Kurds and the United States forces have forged an agreement, the Kurdish regional government, and also the Syrian opposition front that's led by a Kurd, have also signed agreements with the American forces to combat the spread of ISIS and ISIL. And also, unfortunately, in the last few months, actually in the last year or more than a year, there has been attacks on buildings, water resources, dams by ISIS. And many Kurdish forces have actually been hit and were hurt during this incidents. They are reviving their forces, and it's a constant threat. And we have to be very vigilant from all fronts that ISIS can take over again and come back and cause a lot of damage.
The U.S. administrations, all of them, have repeatedly claimed that ISIS is finished, that they don't have the resources, that they lost control of the territory, their fighters are scattered, and they've moved on to other places. But where are all these people coming from? If ISIS has allegedly left Iraq and have moved on to, Africa or wherever else, who then is now being recruited, and by whom, and how are they, why are they regaining strength? How are they able to do that?
Well, I believe that some of the ISIS groups and militants survived and are scattered in Syria, and some are also in Iraq and Turkey. Unfortunately, Turkey gives them full access to the border, They pass through Istanbul and go to the border between Syria and Iraq and enter that way. But they are still there and they're still a threat. And I don't think they are completely gone. I don't think it's over. This war in Ukraine has probably, because some of the militants are fighting there, but I think they're going to come back and we have to be very vigilant.
So the biggest open secret and the biggest scandal that never became a scandal is the fact that multiple state actors continue to either turn a blind eye or even actively facilitate ISIS, which is a threat to US forces in the region, to its allies, to the civilian Kurdish populations, and many others. How is it possible that consequent US administrations, both Democrats and Republicans, have failed to hold Turkey and anyone else accountable for that specific threat? ISIS is indisputably a terrorist organization. ISIS is universally recognized by a threat. It's not a political issue. Everyone agrees that it's, that it's on the level of any international organizations and is a threat. Then how is it that the facilitators of it are not pressured on this specific issue? There's been no investigations, no sanctions, no political accounting of any sort. What's the explanation for this?
The relationship between United States and Turkey is strained, as we know, and behind closed doors, they might be reprimanding Turkey for their actions and their human rights abuses and the cross-border attacks to Turkey, to Syria and Iraq. But we haven't heard of anything, no condemnation by the US government, both Republican and Democrat administrations. And as far as Iran is concerned, United States is basically mostly concerned about the nuclear deal and having Iran have nuclear capacity and reviving the agreement that President Trump did not honor and walked out of it. Unfortunately, Tehran cannot be trusted. And most likely they are continuing their nuclear activities and nuclear enarmament. With Syria, it's one of the states that United States has no relationship with and no influence on Assad. Baghdad gets its cues from Tehran because most of the MPs used to live in Iran and are loyal to the Iranian government. They are Shiites, just like Iran, and have spent a lot of time in Iran, and as such have loyalties that are, they are not serving the Iraqi population, they're serving themselves, unfortunately. The majority of the Iraqi parliament is under the Shiite leadership, if you may. And Sunnis have very little role, and the Kurds have limited role as well.
Now, what has been Russia's role in these more recent events? We are seeing that Russia and Iran are cooperating on drones and now missiles in Ukraine, and that Iranians have gone even to Ukraine directly and have been killed in action as advisors and so forth. How Russia in the past has tried to insinuate itself into the Kurdish issue as a broker and mediator, so forth. The Soviet Union had backed the PKK in the past, trained them. What is Russia doing now about this?
Well, Russia has taken a role because they are friendly and supporting Assad in Syria, and they are supporting Erdogan and the Turkish government in their efforts. And actually, Syria facilitated and interfered when Turkey was bombing Kurdish villages in Syria, and also Syria, the Soviet forces also attacked the Kurdish cities and villages. In Iran, it looks like Iran and Russia have a rapprochement, and it looks like Iran is going to provide assistance with probably attacking Ukraine.
But do you think Russia can in the future be counted on to provide reciprocal assistance against Kurds or in other groups that under Iran's line of interest in the Middle East?
It's very interesting. Russia could play an interesting role, actually, if they were not so biased by Assad and so biased by the Iranian government and also by Turkey. Russia doesn't have that direct relationship that they have with Assad and Erdogan and Tehran that they have in Iraq. Iraq is mostly involved with the US government, the coalition forces, and unfortunately with the Iranian government at some level. Not all of them, but most of them. But as far as they could broker peace, they could broker rights for Kurds if they want. They're at a position where they could influence Syria to accept an autonomy for the Kurdish population in Kurdish areas. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened.
Now, US, for whatever reason, kept putting all of its eggs into the Baghdad basket of relationship, even though Baghdad has, for sure, since Saddam Hussein's fall, have gravitated towards Iran, and there is, despite unpopular Iran-backed policies throughout the country, there is no political move away from it that we have seen. They've tried with Sadr, they tried without Sadr. None of that has worked to distance Baghdad from Iran. It's just there. Even with Soleimani dead, it's still, the trajectory is still very much not in the direction of pushing away Iranian influence. Do you think there is room for the Kurds to start playing a greater role as an ally and to assert an independent position when Baghdad has proven again to be a complete disappointment?
Baghdad has been a disappointment to the Kurds and the Iraqi constitution, in fact, because the Iraqi constitution stipulates that if the Kurds do not want to stay in Iraq, within Iraq, they can seek independence. But unfortunately, the last experience we had where the Kurds conducted their own referendum on separation, and 95% of the population voted yes. They want to be separated from Iraq because Iraq is also practicing this carrot and stick operations with the Kurdistan Regional Government. They control the budget, they control oil sales, and because of the revenue sharing, which the Kurds should get every year, Baghdad is not following through and not giving the Kurdish regional government the budget they need to operate. Even though it's been agreed upon every year, there is negotiations going on and talks, and the Kurdish delegation goes from Erbil to Baghdad, and the Baghdad delegation comes to Erbil, and they don't reach an agreement, and people are without salaries and without money to operate.
Now, there are also a lot of civil and human rights issues that are being essentially shut out of the press due to these larger geopolitical events, women's rights issues, educational issues, internal political concerns inside the KRG-controlled territories. What can be done to provide, what can the US or anyone else can do to provide assistance to the civilian populations there and to kind of regenerate a society.
Yes, the civilian population, the majority of the civilian population in all divided parts of Kurdistan are really suffering and struggling. They are suffering with rights, human rights issues, right of women to education and to higher education, as well as marriage and divorce rights, and all of those civil rights, if you may, are deprived of the Kurdish population, and very little is being done, both nationally and internationally, in this aspect, in ameliorating the situation for the Kurdish civilian population. Unless there's some international support for the Kurds and international intervention, I don't see how the Kurds can achieve anything without the help of the international community.
Have there been any formal lobbying effort in the last couple of years? Because for whatever reason, the Kurdish issue has just gone dark and silent, at least in Washington. I may be unaware of that, but you've been in those circles all your life. What can you tell us about the current efforts and the current dialogue and discussions taking place?
The Kurds of Iran are constantly lobbying, if you may, or advocating on the Hill, and they have representatives here in Washington, D.C. that are carrying out these activities. They have support, but there hasn't been issued any legal document or anything supporting the Kurds. The Kurds in Turkey, the HDP, has a representation in Washington, D.C., and carries out advocacy efforts and lobbying for basic human rights and for civilians' populations' rights. The Kurds in Syria have a presence in Washington, D.C., and are continuously lobbying. The KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government, has an office in Washington, D.C., and is lobbying Congress for issues related to their relationship with Baghdad, incursions of Turkish forces and Iranian forces into Kurdish territory, and other issues that are important to the Kurdistan Regional Government. So there is effort. Is it united? No. Are they working together? To a certain degree they are, but not to a large degree where you could see beneficial. If those forces could be united and could work together, it would serve the Kurdish cause much better.
What do you think it's needed for that to happen?
I think that they need to sit down and draft some resolution, some plan of action, develop some steps, baby steps in the beginning to recognize each other, respect each other, and work together. It's basic things. It's hard, like I mentioned, the psychology of people that are divided, of being under dictatorship. They have very, very low level of trust towards each other and towards others. And this has really impacted the ability of the Kurds to be united. And there are other factors, obviously. They don't agree on ideology and some of their political acts. Some people believe in Kurdistan independence, and some people believe in self-administration or autonomy within the same borders of the country that they are trying to establish rights with. So those are some of the areas where they have conflict, and unfortunately, they haven't reached that level. They work together, they see each other, they contribute to each other's events, but to have a one plan action is not there.
There's no unified position, and there's no unified leadership on any particular front.
That's correct. The leadership is within, let's say, with Kurdistan, Iraq, and KRG, it's within the Kurdish forces or Kurdish political figures that are in the leadership role. And in Iran, the same thing, in Turkey, the same thing, and in Syria, the same thing. I have more hope for Syria to be soon have a self-administration or autonomy agreement with Assad, but Assad flip-flops on the issue all the time.
What do you think can be done to kind of raise all of this more in the public consciousness? Because right now the Kurdish issues have fallen by the wayside, and they have been relatively, despite the fact that all these events have been continuing for years now, there hasn't been much international excitement or involvement over them. What do you think needs to happen to kind of bring back this issue to the forefront? Because geopolitical shifts will continue, and so long as Kurds remain a non-state actor, they will always have lesser priority in the international community's consciousness than whatever happens with state actors. But that doesn't mean that their issues are in fact any less important. It's still human beings, still human rights, still, you know, important economic and political factors. What needs to happen to kind of break through the noise?
Yeah, I think we need to be working harder and advocating more, and also going to Congress and the Senate, to Congress, to the House and the Senate, and advocating for the rights of the Kurdish population within those countries, as well as the need for an independent Kurdish state where it's a safe haven for all Kurds, and they can take in the Kurdish population that's being deported and ethnically cleansed in one country, and they can live in the Kurdistan government region area. Kurdistan regional government is hosting a big population of IDPs that are from the south of Iraq and the center, and also has Iranian Kurdish refugees and Syrian Kurdish refugees. And they are not equipped to handle it because the schools are overloaded, the hospitals are overloaded, the transportation system is overloaded with many refugees and IDPs. And as such, there is a need for a consolidated, unified effort to bring the Kurdish cause and the Kurdish issue back on the center front.
We have seen a number of mass atrocities and genocides. We have seen the Yazidi genocide recognized by the international community. There's been some rebuilding efforts, but overall the population is scattered. The culture is damaged. There's been no real accountability for anyone but a small minority of the ISIS war criminals, and certainly some of the same people have encountered each other in Turkey as well, from everything I've heard, or in Germany and other places. It's a genocide without a real consequence for it. There's been no big war crime tribunals, no reconciliation efforts, no mass move to rebuild that society. What can you tell us? What's the insight about what's going on? How does that fit in within the Kurdish community? And what do you see as the future trajectory for this particular situation?
I think the efforts of unifying the Kurdish forces and Kurdish efforts can help very much in that area where we could advocate more and lobby for ramifications, or even holding some of the people that carried out these operations accountable and bring them to justice. One simple example is that even though Iraq has a new government, they have not recognized the genocide that was carried out by Saddam Hussein as crimes against humanity. Simple recognition and restitution of some of their properties and some of their belongings has not been carried out, even though it's confirmed that over 300,000 Kurds were killed during Anfal operations. So very little is being discussed as far as genocide against the Kurds, atrocities committed against the Kurds. It doesn't even make it to the news on CNN, let alone local news chapters and news outlets. And I don't know what the reason is for marginalizing the Kurdish issue and not. There is a fatigue within the media, within the community of how much they can intervene and how much they can cover. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the Kurdish issue is not on the center front. It's not even on the margins.
You have created, you have written a book explaining the historical and political parameters of the Kurdish role in the Middle East. What do you hope to see? Who is your target audience? Do you see this as trying to push this book into the educational curriculum in the Middle East studies departments, for instance?
That would be good if it can be used in education for universities. That would be, or community colleges. That would be good. And I would have to have somebody or a publicist that would do that. That would actually contact the different universities and education systems and see how we can bring that book to the level of students and academia.
I understand that in recent years, there's been some efforts to introduce Kurdish studies in some universities in the United States, but clearly much more needs to be added. The Middle East Studies Department have been dominated by Arab and Iran curriculum with assorted governments or players essentially funding those efforts, and as a result, the rich tapestry of other societies and cultures has been overlooked and certainly not studied or understood. I understand there is more experience with that in Europe, but has there been an effort to bring some of the European experts on this issue or the professors to who specialize in that to the US to kind of?
Kurdish Human Rights Watch used to have a annual national congress where we would invite speakers, historians, writers, people who are interested in the Kurdish issue and Kurdish cause, and have them give presentations and papers, which were then later presented in a book called Kurdistan Times that was also published quarterly. That actually helped because it brought the speakers, the writers, the authors to the table and helped make it possible for them to talk about the different issues that are facing the Kurdish population. There are some writers and some authors that are interested in the Kurds in Iraq, and some of them are interested in Kurds in Turkey and Iran and Syria. But there isn't one author that covers everything. And perhaps that's something needed to be done about that more than it is.
What happened to these symposia? Are they no longer active, and if so, why not? What can be done to bring back this cultural element of these get-togethers? And
yeah, the organization itself is no longer around. They unfortunately they had to close down, and
Why? What happened?
well, lack of funding and support was one of the main reasons, and it was just too expensive to carry on the operations without support and without financial support. So that was one of the reasons, and that was a good forum for the conferences and meetings. And we used to also have would go to a state where, for instance, we would go to Nashville, Tennessee, where there is a large Kurdish population, and would have councils and meetings, men's groups, women's groups, family groups, and they would discuss all the issues that are important to the community and what solutions they see to that issues. And another community that we would go to was San Diego, California, where there's a large Kurdish population as well, and Los Angeles as well. Some of these elements can be revived with some modest funding. Conferences can be done again and collect all the people that together so that they can talk about different issues and ways to work together and make things change.
I mean, quite frankly, it's in the interest of both the Kurdish communities here and KRG and others to support this sort of thing, because if they are not going to show interest in their own issues, who is going to be respectful of them?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's something that needs more work. And like you say, if they don't do it, then who will? And if they don't take care of their own issues, who would? But I get emails all the time about people wanting to meet and getting together and having a conference, roundtable discussions. And I participate in some, but none of them to the level of Kurdish Human Rights Watch, where we had the annual national meeting.
Well, in terms of myself, besides this program, which is a great forum for in-depth one-on-one discussions, I personally also host panel discussions on various issues with my other podcast on the Washington Outsider directly. So anyone who is interested in organizing a panel is welcome to do that. And now I'm happy to provide a platform, at least as a start.
That's a good start. Yes, that would be good.
And I'll be happy to help, learn more and bring together people, because this is important. But unless people are hearing it, unless it's out there, no one is going to, go around their day just asking themselves, well, what's going on with the Kurds?
Yes, there is so much going on, both nationally and internationally, that it's hard for people to just focus on the Kurdish issue instead of the other issues that they are having: economy, employment, all kinds of issues that are ongoing in the United States and internationally.
Well, hopefully we can put this to start. I'm glad that we have a chance to discuss your work. I'm glad that it's starting to get out there. Please tell the listeners where they can find it so that they could check it out for themselves as well.
Yeah, it is on Amazon. It's called Kurds, Kurdistan, and Iraq. And I don't know if you have a way of putting the link on your show.
You can share it in the chat and also read it out loud.
Okay. There is a website. Okay, hold on.
So there is a website besides Amazon. You can also find Kurds, Kurdistan, and Iraq on KurdsKurdistanIraq.com.
Yes, if you go to amazon.com, you can find it. And it's the link is there for Amazon.
I hope everyone who's watched this will check it out and get the book. It's available on Kindle for now, but hopefully there'll be hard copies available later in the future as well. And recommend it to your friends, share, and if you can think of a great platform to continue these discussions, please be in touch with Dr. Karadaghi. And as for me, as I mentioned, my platforms are always open, and I hope to have a lot more of these on these issues in the future. It's time to
Absolutely.
rewrite.
I look forward to it. Yes. I
Thank
look
you.
forward to it.
Thank you so
You're
much
welcome.
for joining us today. And for those watching, this was Irina Zuckerman on the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With us was Dr. Pari Karadaghi. We were discussing the issues facing Kurds, particularly in Iraq, and what can be done to address them. Please stay tuned for future programming. We are going to have our next show next week, usual time, Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.